It was April 12, 2008, in Clearwater, Florida. Rachel Monroe, a 20-year-old marine biology student, finished her late shift at a café near the coast. She walked out into the night, heading toward her car, the same routine she had done countless times before. But this time, she vanished. The next morning, she never showed up for class. Her friends couldn't reach her. Her family grew worried. Soon after, police found her silver sedan parked at Honeymoon Island. The driver's door was slightly open. The keys were still in the ignition. Inside the car sat her canvas tote with books and a field notebook, untouched. Around the vehicle, investigators noticed something chilling. Footprints pressed into the sand in chaotic patterns. A torn piece of jeans lay nearby, streaked with dried blood. From that moment, it was clear. This wasn't a young woman who chose to disappear. Something darker had happened. Attention quickly turned to Ethan Clark, Rachel's ex-boyfriend. They had split only months earlier. Witnesses recalled heated arguments between them. His alibi was shaky, and the town whispered his name. Detectives pulled his DNA, hoping for a match, but the results excluded him. With no leads left, suspicion lingered, but the trail went cold. Months passed. Vigils were held. Her family begged for answers. But by the end of 2008, Rachel's disappearance was officially labeled a cold case. For the next 15 years, her story sat buried in a file, revisited only on anniversaries, a reminder of a life interrupted without explanation. Then, in 2023, new technology would pull Rachel's case out of silence. Genetic genealogy, a method once used for family trees, was now breaking open cases once thought unsolvable. When investigators tested the old evidence again, they found a path that pointed directly to someone who had been there the entire time. This is the story of how Rachel's disappearance haunted a community, how evidence was overlooked, and how justice finally emerged after more than a decade. Stay with us as we walk through every detail, from the night Rachel vanished to the shocking discovery 15 years later. And tell us in the comments. April 12, 2008, Clearwater, Florida. A quiet Saturday evening. For most people in the city, it was a normal night. But for 20-year-old Rachel Monroe, a marine biology student at the University of South Florida, it was the last time anyone would see her alive. Rachel had just finished a late shift at a small café in the downtown area. It was routine for her. She clocked out around 10:30 p.m., said goodnight to her coworkers, and walked out into the night, alone. She was expected back at her dorm soon after. That was her pattern. Work, drive home, rest, and prepare for classes the next morning. But this night did not follow the pattern. Rachel never made it home. The first sign something was wrong came the next morning. Rachel was absent from her morning lecture. Friends tried to call her phone. No answer. Text messages went unread. By afternoon, her family grew worried. Rachel wasn't the type to vanish without explanation. The Monroe family reported her missing to Clearwater police. Only a few hours later, investigators located her silver sedan at the Honeymoon Island State Park parking lot. What they found inside the car raised immediate suspicion. The driver's side door was slightly open, as if left in a hurry. The keys were still in the ignition. On the passenger seat lay her canvas tote bag. Inside were several textbooks and a field notebook she used for her marine biology studies. Nothing appeared stolen. Her wallet, phone, and personal belongings were untouched. To investigators, this scene was not consistent with someone voluntarily walking away. The car looked like it had been abandoned in the middle of routine activity. The area surrounding the vehicle told a darker story. On the ground near the lot, officers documented a set of chaotic footprints pressed into damp sand and soil. The pattern suggested a struggle, not a casual stroll. Scattered impressions showed sudden movement, irregular spacing, and overlapping tracks. Just a short distance away, search teams found a torn piece of denim fabric. It looked like part of a pair of jeans. Police released initial details. A 20-year-old woman, last seen leaving her workplace around 10:30 p.m. Her car discovered with keys left behind, personal belongings untouched, and possible evidence of a struggle nearby. They did not mention the denim fragment publicly at first, but word circulated in the community that blood had been found. The Monroe family was stunned. They gathered at the police station, pleading for updates, while friends circulated Rachel's photo on flyers and social media pages. Clearwater, a place where violent crime was relatively rare, suddenly felt unsafe. Parents warned their children not to go out at night. Conversations in grocery stores, schools, and churches revolved around the missing student. For investigators, the car was a critical starting point. They documented fingerprints, tested for DNA, and collected fibers. The tote bag was dusted and its contents logged. The jeans fragment was sent to the lab for urgent analysis. The chaotic footprints were photographed and measured, though rain threatened to wash them away before casts could be made. Neighbors and visitors at the park were interviewed. One couple recalled seeing a silver sedan in the lot late that night, but they didn't notice anyone around it. Another witness remembered hearing raised voices near the shoreline around 11 p.m., though they couldn't identify who was involved. Still, no direct sighting of Rachel after leaving the café was confirmed. By the second day, search efforts expanded. Helicopters scanned the coastline. Boats patrolled waters near the island. Volunteers formed human chains across open fields. The urgency was clear. Investigators feared the case was moving from a missing persons search to something far more serious. Press conferences were held at police headquarters. Officials stated they were treating the case as suspicious. Reporters asked if they believed foul play was involved. The answer: yes, we have reason to suspect this was not a voluntary disappearance. The evidence supported that statement. A young woman, reliable and consistent in her daily routine, suddenly vanished. Her car was left with the keys still inside. A bag full of books sat untouched. There were signs of a struggle on the ground, and a torn, blood-stained. But behind the public displays of hope, investigators knew the first hours were critical. The longer Rachel remained missing, the more likely the outcome would be grim. Crime scene technicians worked around the clock. The denim fragment was processed first. Blood tests confirmed it was human. DNA was extracted and entered into state databases. At that time, no immediate match was found, but it became the single most important piece of evidence from the early investigation. The footprints told a second story. Analysts noted at least two different patterns, one likely belonging to Rachel, the other belonging to a larger, heavier individual. The tracks overlapped, diverged, and circled back, supporting the theory of a confrontation. Family members clung to the hope of a rescue. Police, however, were already bracing for the worst. By Monday morning, Clearwater police confirmed to reporters that they were interviewing people close to Rachel, starting with her friends and former boyfriend. Standard procedure in cases like this, but also a step that would soon shift the investigation in a new direction. For the Monroe family, the nightmare had only begun. For the community, The disappearance of Rachel Monroe was a sudden reminder that danger could exist close to home. And for investigators, the suspicious scene at Honeymoon Island marked the opening chapter of what would become a 15-year battle for justice. After the scene at Honeymoon Island was secured, detectives turned to the people closest to Rachel. In disappearances like this, the circle usually starts with family, friends, and recent partners. Very quickly, one name rose to the top of the list: Ethan Clark. Ethan was 22 years old, Rachel's ex-boyfriend. The two had broken up about 3 months before she vanished. Friends said the breakup was not dramatic, but it was clear they wanted different things. Rachel was focused on her studies, determined to pursue a career in marine biology. Then came a witness statement that alarmed detectives. Just 1 week before Rachel disappeared, a fellow student claimed to have seen her and Ethan in the parking lot near campus. According to this witness, the argument was heated. Rachel appeared upset, and Ethan was visibly angry. For investigators, this detail was important. It showed that tensions were still present weeks after their breakup. Detectives brought Ethan in for questioning. He admitted that he and Rachel had argued, but he denied having anything to do with her disappearance. When asked about the night of April 12th, he claimed he was home with his stepfather. On paper, it sounded like an alibi, but there was a problem. The stepfather could not provide a clear timeline. He remembered Ethan being around, but the hours were vague. There was no receipt, no timestamp, no independent witness to confirm where Ethan was at the crucial time. This made investigators uneasy. A shaky alibi, recent arguments, and a personal history with the victim. It all fit the profile of a possible suspect. Ethan was not arrested, but suspicion hung heavily over him. Behind the scenes, the case against Ethan grew in the court of public opinion. Rumors spread quickly in Clearwater. On social media and in conversations around town, people whispered that Rachel's ex-boyfriend must have been involved. The story was simple, and simple stories often feel convincing. A breakup, jealousy, anger, revenge. To many it made sense. But investigators knew they needed more than theories. They had evidence from the scene. The torn jeans, the dried blood, the footprints. They needed to see if Ethan could be connected to any of it. Detectives requested a DNA sample from him. Ethan complied. The swab was sent to the lab, compared against the material collected from the jeans. Weeks later, the results came back. It was not a match. Ethan's DNA did not appear on the evidence. The blood was not his. The case against him collapsed almost as quickly as it had formed. For detectives, this was both a relief and a setback. On one hand, it cleared a prime suspect. On the other, it pushed the case back into uncertainty. Without Ethan, they were left with nothing but the same. This pattern is common in unsolved cases. Investigators call it the first suspected syndrome. The first person to be investigated often becomes the lasting focus of community suspicion, even when evidence proves otherwise. Ethan Clark became a textbook example of this phenomenon. While he moved away, the Monroe family was left with no answers. Detectives had eliminated Ethan, but no new leads had surfaced. The focus on him had consumed precious weeks, maybe months, and when the investigation widened again, the trail was already growing cold. The torn jeans and footprints remained unexplained. The car sat in impound, offering no further clues. Forensic technology at the time could not extract more from the DNA sample. Without matches, the case hit a wall. But in 2008, the community did not see the limits of the evidence. They saw a young woman gone, a boyfriend with a weak alibi, and no other suspects. Even as the official investigation moved on, the court of public opinion did not. Ethan Clark carried that weight, while the real answers lay hidden for another 15 years. The early focus on Ethan would later be remembered as a turning point in the investigation. Detectives had not been reckless, they followed a logical path. But the failure to look beyond him quickly enough meant the case lost momentum. By the end of the year, the disappearance of Rachel Monroe had shifted from an active search to an open wound in Clearwater. And Ethan Clark, though cleared, was left marked by suspicion he would never fully escape. When police announced that Ethan Clark's DNA did not match the evidence, the Monroe family should have felt some relief. But instead, the news left them more desperate than before. The one person everyone believed might have answers was cleared. And there was nothing else. No new suspect, no new lead. Only silence. Linda Monroe, Rachel's mother, took the hardest blow. Friends said she withdrew from her work and her social life. She struggled with daily routines. For her, every unanswered phone call from the police felt like another confirmation that her daughter was slipping further into the past. Rachel's father and extended relatives refused to accept the silence. They called the Clearwater Police Department constantly, asking for updates. For the people of Clearwater, Rachel's disappearance struck a nerve. It wasn't just another crime story. It was a reminder that danger could reach into their own streets. Parents said they no longer felt comfortable letting their daughters walk home alone at night. Students avoided evening classes. The city carried an uneasy tension. Speculation filled the void left by the stalled investigation. On online forums, in the comments of news articles, even in whispered conversations at the grocery store, theories grew. Some were convinced Ethan was guilty, no matter what the DNA said. Others believed a stranger had stalked Rachel, waiting for the right opportunity. Still others insisted the police had overlooked someone close to her family or friends. 6 months passed. There was no arrest, no new press conference, no major update. And in the fall of 2008, the Clearwater Police Department made it official. Rachel Monroe's case was classified as a cold case. For the Monroe family, the announcement felt like a second loss. The first was Rachel herself. The second was hope that answers might come quickly. Now her file was placed in the same cabinet as hundreds of other unsolved cases in Florida. But the family refused to give up. They wrote letters to state investigators, urging them to reopen the search. They contacted federal agencies asking for resources. They reached out to national organizations that supported families of missing persons. At every turn, the message was the same. Resources were limited, and the case lacked active leads. Still, the Monroes tried to keep Rachel's name alive. They spoke to local television reporters whenever they were offered a slot. They gave interviews to newspapers on the anniversaries of her disappearance. Each time they repeated the same plea: someone knows something, and we need answers. For a time, those efforts brought attention. In 2009, the case was featured in several Florida newspapers. Rachel's photograph, smiling in her college sweatshirt, returned to the front page. Tips came in, but none were substantial. Leads fizzled out as quickly as they appeared. By 2010, coverage slowed. Reporters moved on to new stories. The Vigils became smaller. The Monroe family carried that frustration every day. They saw how the world moved on while their daughter's file gathered dust. They saw how investigators rotated in and out of the cold case unit, each new detective unfamiliar with the details, each promising to review the evidence, but few delivering new results. Linda Monroe, despite her grief, kept pushing. She organized letters, petitions, and meetings. She contacted crime shows, hoping one might cover Rachel's case. Some episodes featured her briefly, but the exposure never generated the break they needed. By 2015, Rachel's disappearance had reached its 7th year. By then, most families were told the likelihood of recovery was slim. Statistically, cold cases rarely advanced after the first 12 months without strong leads. But the Monroes refused to treat Rachel as a statistic. Every year they stood at Honeymoon Island, holding a candle, repeating the same words. We still remember. We still wait. Yet outside of those vigils, the case was fading. Residents who had once followed every update no longer spoke about it. Students at the university grew up hearing the story as local lore rather than breaking news. To the next generation, Rachel was not a classmate or neighbor. She was a name from the past. That shift was the hardest part for the Monroes. Not just the lack of answers, but the sense that time was erasing Rachel from the community's memory. They had lost their daughter, and now they were losing her presence in the public eye. By the end of the decade, Rachel's file sat untouched most of the time. Detectives occasionally reviewed it when new technology or procedures were introduced, but nothing stuck. The torn jeans, the footprints, the car in the parking lot. Those pieces of evidence told a story, but without a suspect, the story had no ending. The Monroe family's persistence kept the case from being completely forgotten. They showed up every year. They pushed every agency. They never stopped talking about Rachel. But for Clearwater, the case was slipping into the background. A community shaken in 2008 had slowly learned to live with unanswered questions. And Rachel, now, that day had come. Detectives in Clearwater pulled Rachel's evidence out of storage and submitted it for a full reanalysis. The lab used advanced sequencing that could compare unknown DNA to databases of voluntary submissions. These databases, often built by people searching for family history, had become a quiet revolution in solving crimes. By comparing genetic markers, investigators could find relatives of an unknown suspect, even distant ones, and build a family tree that might lead to the right person. When the results came back, they showed a partial match. The blood from Rachel's genes was connected to a distant relative who had uploaded their DNA to a genealogy site. It wasn't the suspect, but it was the first real link detectives had held in 15 years. From there, genealogists stepped in. They built a family tree from the partial match, tracing connections across generations, eliminating branches one by one. It was tedious work, requiring public records, obituaries, marriage licenses, and census data. But slowly, the picture narrowed. The process pointed to one family living in Clearwater. Within that family, one man stood out. Mark Doyle. He was 52 years old, a heating and air conditioning repairman. He lived just a few streets from the Monroe family. At first glance, Doyle seemed ordinary. He had no major criminal record. Neighbors described him as quiet, even helpful at times. Back in 2008, he had volunteered in the search for Rachel. He attended candlelight vigils. He stood beside grieving neighbors, offering support. No one had looked at him twice, but the genealogy pointed straight to him. Detectives knew they needed confirmation. They began surveillance on Doyle. Over several days, they watched him carefully, waiting for an opportunity. That opportunity came when Doyle discarded a can of soda outside his home. Investigators retrieved it, rushed it to the lab, and tested the DNA on its rim. The results left no doubt. The DNA from the soda can matched the DNA on the torn jeans collected at Honeymoon Island in 2008. The blood at the scene belonged to Mark Doyle. For detectives, it was the breakthrough they had. When the Monroe family received the news, the reaction was complicated. There was relief that the case had not been forgotten, relief that the evidence still mattered. But there was also a deep sense of betrayal. They remembered Doyle standing beside them at Vigils, offering words of sympathy. To learn he was the one who had left Rachel in that parking lot was almost too much to accept. Clearwater, too, was shaken. Neighbors who once thought of Doyle as a harmless figure now realized he had been hiding in plain sight. Parents who had shared meals with him, residents who had waved to him across their yards, all had to come to terms with the truth. The predator they feared might be a stranger had been one of their own. For the investigators, though, the focus was on building a case that would stand in court. The DNA match was powerful, but they needed to tie Doyle directly to the events of April 2008. They began reviewing his history, his work records, his movements at the time of the crime. They re-interviewed neighbors, asking if anyone recalled seeing Doyle near Honeymoon Island that night. As they pulled the threads together, the portrait of Doyle became darker. He was not on anyone's radar in 2008 because he had kept a low profile. But the genealogy evidence made it clear. The blood on Rachel's torn jeans belonged to him. There was no coincidence. No alternate explanation. After 15 years of waiting, the mystery of Rachel Monroe's disappearance had a name. Mark Doyle. The man who had blended into the background of his community, who had helped search for a girl he knew would never be found alive, was now identified as the suspect. The announcement of the breakthrough marked a turning point. What had long been considered an unsolvable cold case was now moving toward resolution. Families of other missing persons across Florida took notice. If genealogy could bring justice to the Monroe family after so many years, perhaps it could do the same for them. For Clearwater, the revelation was both a shock and a warning. It showed how far technology had come. It showed that evidence preserved, even when it seemed useless, could one day speak again. And the arrest unfolded in the early morning hours. Neighbors stepped outside as unmarked cars rolled up. Officers approached the front door, knocked, and waited. When Doyle answered, he looked startled but calm. He was taken into custody without resistance. Some residents watched from their porches, stunned. To them, Doyle had always been the quiet repairman, the neighbor who fixed air conditioners, kept to himself, and even showed up at community gatherings. Seeing him led away in handcuffs was almost impossible to process. The charges were grave: first-degree murder and kidnapping in connection with Rachel Monroe's disappearance 15 years earlier. The announcement sent shockwaves through Clearwater. For years, Doyle had been seen as a supportive figure. In 2008, he had joined search parties. He had lit candles at Vigils, standing only feet away from Rachel's grieving family. For Linda Monroe, Rachel's mother, the news was unbearable. She remembered shaking his hand at one of those vigils and thanking him for his help. To learn that the man she once called a kind neighbor had been the one responsible all along was almost too much to comprehend. The story spread quickly. Within hours, local news stations were running live broadcasts from outside Doyle's house. By the afternoon, national outlets had picked it up. Headlines were blunt and striking. Cold case solved by DNA after 15 years. Neighbor behind Rachel Monroe's disappearance. Commentators on morning shows debated how a man who lived in plain sight could avoid suspicion for so long. The public reaction was intense. Clearwater residents filled social media with posts expressing both relief and anger. Relief that the case was finally moving forward. Anger that it had taken 15 years, and that Doyle had been free all that time. Some said they felt tricked, remembering how Doyle had joined community searches. Others were furious at the police, arguing that obvious leads had been missed. How could investigators not look closer at a man who lived so near the Monroe family, who had inserted himself into the search, who had access to the very park where Rachel's car was found? Experts weighed in. Criminal profilers explained how offenders sometimes join search parties or attend For the community, the arrest shattered a sense of trust. People had to reconcile the fact that a man they had considered harmless had been living among them all along. Parents asked themselves how many other predators might be hiding behind friendly smiles and ordinary jobs. Neighborhood gatherings turned to uneasy conversations. The question repeated over and over. If it could happen with Doyle, who else might be hiding in plain sight? The Monroe family spoke briefly through a prepared statement. They expressed gratitude for the detectives who had persisted and for the new technology that had made the arrest possible. But they also admitted the pain of realizing that Doyle had stood beside them for years, pretending to share their grief. Linda Monroe, who had once thanked him publicly, said she felt betrayed in a way words could not capture. Clearwater police held a press conference. They confirmed the DNA match, explained the process of genealogical tracing, and announced the formal charges. Reporters pressed them about why Doyle had not been considered earlier. The department defended its original investigation, saying Doyle had no criminal record and no direct ties to Rachel at the time. Still, many in the public were not satisfied. They believed the police had missed signs that should have been obvious. As the media frenzy grew, Doyle's name became known nationwide. Articles traced his quiet life, his work history, and his participation in community events. Photos of him from 2008 surfaced, showing him standing in crowds at Vigils. The contrast between those images and his mugshot was stark. To the public, it was proof of how easily someone could hide behind normalcy. In Clearwater, emotions ran high. At one gathering outside City Hall, residents held signs reading, "Justice for Rachel," and "Never again." Anger was directed not only at Doyle, but also at the system that had allowed him to remain free. Speakers demanded more funding for cold case units, faster adoption of forensic technology, and greater accountability for investigative failures. The arrest also sparked broader conversations across Florida. How many other cold cases could be solved if old evidence was tested with new methods? How many families were still waiting for justice that could be within reach? Rachel's case became... Still, the arrest gave them something they had not had in years: a path forward. For the first time since 2008, they could see the possibility of justice in a courtroom. And for a community that had lived under a shadow of uncertainty, the capture of Mark Doyle was both a shock and a relief. The story of Rachel Monroe was no longer just about a disappearance. It was now about betrayal, survival, and the long road to accountability. And as Clearwater tried to absorb the truth, attention turned to what would come next: Doyle's interrogation, his confession, and the details of what really happened on that April night in 2008. Stay with us as we uncover the chilling account Doyle gave investigators, and how his words matched the evidence from Honeymoon Island. And let us know in the comments. Do you believe killers can truly hide forever in plain sight? Or will technology always catch up with them in the end? After his arrest in July 2023, Mark Doyle was taken to the Clearwater Police Department. He was placed in a small interrogation room, a camera recording every moment. At first, Doyle said nothing. He leaned back in his chair, arms folded, answering questions with short denials. Investigators knew this was coming. They also knew they had more than enough leverage to press forward. The DNA evidence was irrefutable. The blood on Rachel Monroe's torn jeans, collected in 2008, matched Doyle's discarded soda can from 2023. Detectives laid out the lab reports on the table in front of him. They explained how the chain of custody was intact, how the genetic markers aligned, how there was no possibility of mistake. Doyle stared at the papers, silent. For nearly an hour he resisted, shaking his head, muttering that he didn't know Rachel, that he had nothing to do with her disappearance. But the silence didn't last. The struggle escalated quickly. Doyle admitted he struck her across the face. She tried to run, but he dragged her back. The confrontation left chaotic footprints in the sand and dirt near the parking lot, the same ones documented by investigators 15 years earlier. Rachel's jeans tore in the struggle. Doyle said blood from a cut on his hand smeared across the fabric. That stain became the silent witness that eventually betrayed him. Doyle then confessed to the fatal moment. He said he wrapped his arm around Rachel's neck and squeezed until she collapsed. There was no plan, no thought, just blind rage. He described it as losing control, claiming he hadn't intended to kill her. But his words carried no weight against the reality of what he had done. Rachel had no chance to escape. After Rachel stopped moving, Doyle panicked. He dragged her toward a patch of sand dunes. He left her there, covered by brush. He admitted discarding the torn jeans nearby, never thinking investigators would find them. He returned to his truck, drove away, and lived the next 15 years as though nothing had happened. The details of his confession matched the crime scene perfectly. The chaotic footprints, the location of the torn jeans, the bloodstains that didn't belong to Rachel. Every piece of evidence from 2008 now had an explanation. Doyle's words filled in the gaps that had haunted detectives for more than a decade. When the confession was presented to the Monroe family, the impact was devastating. Linda Monroe, who had endured 15 years of unanswered questions, collapsed when she heard the description of Rachel's final moments. She had sat through vigils with Doyle standing nearby. She had thanked him publicly for helping. To hear that he had been the one who ended her daughter's life was a cruelty she could hardly bear. The wider community of Clearwater was equally shaken. Residents learned that Doyle had confessed not out of guilt or conscience, but because the DNA evidence left him no way out. His words weren't an act of remorse, they were admissions forced by science. Investigators documented every line of his confession. They secured the transcripts, cross-checked his statements against the original. Detectives concluded that Doyle's testimony was the missing piece they had waited for. For 15 years, Rachel's case had been a cold file, a list of clues without resolution. Now they had not only the DNA, but also Doyle's own account of how it happened. Together, the evidence and confession built a case strong enough to withstand any courtroom challenge. The Monroe family struggled with the knowledge. They wanted justice, but hearing the brutal truth reopened wounds they had tried to cover with years of silence. Each detail was another cut. The grab, the struggle, the strike, the strangulation. They could picture Rachel fighting back, calling for help that never came. For the prosecutors preparing the case, Doyle's confession was invaluable. It would allow them to present a complete story to the jury, supported by both science and words from the suspect himself. For the first time, the timeline of Rachel's last night was not speculation. It was a narrative confirmed by the man who had taken her life. The press soon learned that Doyle had confessed. Headlines blared across the country once again. DNA breakthrough leads to chilling confession.
News anchors summarized the key details, emphasizing how his account matched the crime scene. For many viewers, it was a reminder of why forensic evidence mattered so deeply in cases that otherwise seemed unsolvable. As Clearwater absorbed the news, the sense of betrayal deepened. People remembered Doyle at community events, helping to hang posters, standing in prayer circles, offering condolences. Now they realized those gestures were nothing more than a cover. The man who had caused the suffering had blended in with their grief. The confession closed the investigative chapter of the case, but opened the door to the legal battle ahead. With his words and the DNA evidence, prosecutors were confident in securing a conviction. The community braced itself for the trial, knowing the full story of April 12, 2008, would soon be told in court. For the Monroe family, it was a strange mix of relief and renewed pain. They finally knew what had happened, but knowing didn't lessen the tragedy. It only confirmed the horror they had long feared. The cold case that had haunted Clearwater for 15 years was now complete. The final missing piece had...
Stay with us as we move into Part 7, where Clearwater's outrage explodes into public protests, calls for reform, and a debate over how many cold cases might still hide their answers. And let us know in the comments, do you believe confessions like Doyle's are acts of truth, or just the last defense of men trapped by science? The news of Mark Doyle's confession spread through Clearwater like a shockwave. For 15 years, residents had whispered theories, shared suspicions, and wondered if Rachel Monroe's case would ever be solved. Now, the truth was out. The man who had lived among them, who had joined candlelight vigils, who had stood shoulder to shoulder with grieving neighbors, had admitted to taking her life. The mood of the city shifted overnight. What began as disbelief turned quickly into outrage. Within days of the confession, crowds gathered outside the Clearwater Police Department. Protesters held signs above their heads, words painted in bold strokes. "Justice delayed is justice denied." Others carried photos of Rachel, reminding everyone why they were there. The anger wasn't just about Doyle. It was about the system that had missed him. City Hall saw similar scenes. Rallies grew larger by the evening, with community members demanding accountability. Residents shouted questions through megaphones. Why hadn't Doyle been considered a suspect earlier? Why hadn't evidence been tested with newer methods sooner? And why had the Monroe family been left to suffer for so many years without answers? At the University of South Florida, where Rachel had once been a promising marine biology student, students organized their own demonstrations. Hundreds marched across campus, chanting Rachel's name. One student leader told a local reporter, "Rachel was one of us. She walked these halls. If it can happen to her, it can happen to any of us. We need stronger cold case units. We need to know the system will fight for us." The outrage extended beyond Clearwater. Families across Florida who had loved ones missing saw Rachel's case as a symbol of their own struggles. Parents and siblings from Miami, Orlando, and Tallahassee joined the rallies. They held up pictures of their own relatives, some missing for decades. Legal analysts weighed in too. They pointed out the glaring oversight that Doyle had been present at Vigils, had lived so close to the Monroe family, and yet was never properly investigated. They called it a failure of imagination and persistence in law enforcement. To them, Doyle's confession was proof that some of the earliest suspicions should have been cast wider than a single ex-boyfriend. Pressure mounted for reform. The community demanded better preservation of physical evidence, arguing that too many cases had been left to gather dust in storage rooms. They wanted mandatory reviews of cold cases every few years, using the latest technology. Social media amplified those demands. The hashtag Justice for Rachel spread across platforms, bringing thousands of posts in a matter of days. People shared not just her story, but also stories of their own relatives lost to unsolved cases. The Monroe family took the stage at a press conference. Linda Monroe, still fragile from hearing the details of her daughter's last moments, stood beside her relatives. She spoke slowly but firmly. She called for a statewide overhaul of evidence handling and urged legislators to create funds for families of the missing. Her message was simple. No other family should wait 15 years for answers that were sitting in a storage box. The rallies also sparked debate over the use of DNA databases. Some voices raised concerns about privacy, warning that genealogical data could be misused. But for many in Clearwater, the argument was clear. Without genealogy, Rachel's case would still be unsolved. Her family would still be waiting. A local columnist summed it up. If the price of justice is a debate about privacy, then it is a debate worth having. In Tallahassee, state lawmakers took notice. Under mounting public pressure, the Florida legislature announced plans to expand funding for cold case units across the state. Proposals included hiring more forensic specialists, increasing partnerships with genealogical analysts, and launching a program to systematically re-examine old evidence with new technology. It was a victory for the protesters who had filled the streets. In Clearwater, the sense of betrayal remained raw, but it began to evolve into For Clearwater, the outrage became a kind of reckoning. People who had once trusted that justice would come on its own realized they had to demand it. The case showed them that killers could live in plain sight, that evidence could sit untouched, that justice could be delayed for years. The betrayal cut deep, but it also forced action. The story was no longer just about Rachel Monroe. It had become about every cold case in Florida. Every box of evidence waiting in a warehouse, every family still holding on to hope. Rachel's case was now a catalyst, a rallying point for reform that could reach far beyond Clearwater. As we move forward, the public outrage begins to collide with the legal process. The trial of Mark Doyle will not only expose the details of Rachel's last night, but also test whether the system, after so many failures, can finally deliver justice. And in the next chapter of this case, we will step inside the courtroom, where evidence, confession, and law will decide Mark Doyle's fate once and for all. The long road to justice reached its peak in January 2024. After 15 years of unanswered questions, the trial of Mark Doyle opened in Clearwater. The courthouse was packed. Every seat was taken. Journalists filled the back rows. Families of other missing victims came to watch. And in the first row, the Monroe family braced themselves for the final chapter. From the start, the tension was clear. The prosecutor rose and addressed the jury, reminding them that this was not just another cold case. It was the story of a young woman whose life was stolen and whose family had waited far too long for justice. He told them the evidence was solid, the science was clear, and the truth could no longer be hidden. The state laid out the backbone of their case: DNA and confession. Forensic experts walked the jury through the critical piece of evidence: the torn jeans found near Rachel's abandoned car in 2008. They explained how modern technology had reanalyzed the bloodstains and produced a partial match in 2023. That match led directly to Mark Doyle. The prosecutor reminded the jury that it wasn't coincidence, it was science. The most powerful moment came when the DNA match was displayed in court. Charts and comparisons were shown on screens. The expert concluded, "There is no scientific doubt. The DNA recovered from Rachel Monroe's genes is a complete match to Mark Doyle. The courtroom was silent. The Monroe family held each other as the evidence confirmed what they had waited years to hear. Next, the jury heard Doyle's own words. A recording of his interrogation was played. The tone was flat, but the details were unmistakable. He admitted following Rachel to Honeymoon Island. He admitted trying to approach her. When she refused and tried to leave, he described losing control. He spoke of grabbing her, striking her, and strangling her until she collapsed. Every detail lined up with what investigators had documented back in 2008. The chaotic footprints, the torn jeans, the keys left in the ignition, even the location where he discarded the bloody fabric near the sand dunes. For investigators, it was the final piece. For the family, it was almost unbearable to hear. The prosecution brought in additional witnesses. A crime scene analyst confirmed the struggle marks matched the description Doyle gave years later. A veteran detective explained how Doyle had even joined search parties and vigils, standing side by side with the very people who were looking for the girl he had killed. The betrayal cut deep. The defense tried to fight back. Doyle's attorney argued that the confession should not be trusted. He claimed Doyle was under extreme pressure when questioned, and that the words he spoke might not have been voluntary. He pointed out that no body had ever been recovered, leaving a gap in the evidence. Without a body, he said, how could the jury be certain of what happened? The jury listened, but the prosecution countered every point. They argued that false confessions don't explain precise details that match physical evidence. They reminded the court that Doyle's DNA was not just close, it was an exact match. And they stressed that absence of a body did not erase the science, the confession, or the 15 years of unanswered questions. Inside the courtroom, Mark Doyle sat motionless. He avoided eye contact with the jury. He showed no visible remorse. Witnesses later described him as cold, detached, and almost indifferent to the gravity of the trial. One local resident who had attended the vigils years ago said afterward, "It was chilling to see him just sit there. No emotion, like none of this mattered to him." For the Monroe family, each day of the trial was painful. They listened to technical testimony about DNA sequences. They listened to the exact words Doyle used when describing Rachel's last moments. They listened to arguments over the missing body, over procedure, over whether the case should even be trusted. But through it all, the weight of evidence remained. The prosecutor closed with a simple, powerful statement. This case is about truth. It is about a young woman who never made it home. It is about a family who refused to give up. And it is about a man who thought he could hide forever. The evidence has spoken. The science has spoken. Now justice must speak. The jury deliberated for hours, but not days. When they returned, the tension in the room was overwhelming. The verdict was read aloud. Guilty of first-degree murder. Guilty of kidnapping. The sentence? Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Gasps filled the courtroom. Some in the gallery wept. Others nodded in relief. For the Monroe family, it was the moment they had prayed for, even as it ripped open old wounds. Linda Monroe broke down as the judge confirmed the sentence. Her daughter's killer would never walk free again. But the empty space Rachel left behind would never be filled. Reporters rushed outside to capture the reaction. Neighbors spoke of shock that the quiet man next door had lived among them for so long. One classmate of Rachel's said, "It doesn't bring her back, but at least we know the truth now."
At least her family has some justice. For Clearwater, the verdict was a turning point. It closed one of the town's darkest chapters. For the Monroe family, it was the end of a fight that had consumed 16 years. They had carried Rachel's memory through silence, through anniversaries, through candlelight vigils, through endless waiting. And now, at last, they had an answer. The story of Rachel Monroe's trial is not just about a guilty verdict. It is about the strength of evidence, the power of modern forensics, and the resilience of a family that refused to give up. It is also about the devastating reality that justice, when delayed, never feels complete. As this chapter ends, the case leaves us with a haunting truth. Cold cases are not frozen forever. With persistence, science, and community pressure, they can still be solved. But for every family waiting in silence, the question remains: how many more?
The trial was over. The verdict had been read. Mark Doyle would spend the rest of his life behind bars with no chance of parole. For the Monroe family, it was justice, but justice that arrived more than 15 years too late. Clearwater began to return to its routines, yet the disappearance of Rachel Monroe left a scar that would not fade. People still spoke about that night in 2008, about the car left at Honeymoon Island with the keys in the ignition, about the footprints in the sand, and about the years of silence that followed. For the family, the loss was permanent. But in the months after the trial, Rachel's name began to take on a new life. The University of South Florida announced the creation of the Rachel Monroe Marine Biology Scholarship, dedicated to supporting students who shared her passion for the ocean. It was a way to carry forward the dream she never had the chance to fulfill. At the scholarship's first ceremony, a young student stood before the crowd and said, "Her story reminds me that the work we do matters. I hope to finish what she started." Those words gave Linda Monroe, Rachel's mother, the smallest measure of peace. Beyond the university, law enforcement agencies began to recognize Rachel's case as a landmark example. Forensic specialists highlighted how genetic genealogy turned a cold case into a solved one. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement included the investigation in its training manuals. Detectives studying cold cases across the country were told, "Keep the evidence safe," because new tools might someday break through walls that seem permanent. The state of Florida took the lesson further. Legislators approved expanded funding for cold case units, and new protocols required that biological evidence from missing persons cases be stored indefinitely. Agencies were given access to genealogy databases under strict oversight. Rachel's case was cited as the reason. Lawmakers admitted openly that if this technology had been applied sooner, her family might have had answers years earlier. Other families began to look to Clearwater with hope. Parents who had been waiting for decades wrote to the Monroe family saying, "Your daughter's story keeps us going." If justice came for her, maybe it... At Honeymoon Island, where Rachel's car was found all those years ago, the community built a memorial. It was simple but powerful. A plaque set into stone bore the inscription, "Justice may be delayed, but never forgotten." On the day it was unveiled, dozens gathered with candles, just as they had 15 years earlier during the first vigil. Linda Monroe, older now, frail but unshaken, stood before the crowd. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Rachel's dream lives on through others. Her life was cut short, but her name will help others carry on." For those who had followed the case since 2008,
It was a moment of closure that seemed almost impossible to imagine during the years when the file sat buried on a shelf. The meaning of the case went beyond Rachel herself. It highlighted the importance of protecting evidence, of never discarding even the smallest fragment of fabric or trace of blood. It proved the value of investing in technology, not only for the future, but for the past. It became a warning that every overlooked clue could hold the answer to a family's nightmare. Clearwater had been shaken by betrayal, the realization that the man who had joined their search parties and stood beside them at Vigils was the same man who caused Rachel's disappearance. But the city also became a place of change. It inspired movements across the state to demand better investigative standards and greater accountability. Students, parents, and local officials came together to say that justice, no matter how late, is still worth pursuing. The broader impact was unmistakable. Police chiefs across the country told their departments, "Don't close the files, don't give up." Cold cases that once collected dust were pulled out again, checked against genealogy databases, and in some instances, solved. Each time, the Monroe case was mentioned. Each time, families were reminded that the system could still work, even after years of silence. For Linda Monroe, nothing could erase the years of grief. Nothing could undo the countless nights waiting for news. But she understood that her daughter's case had changed the system. What began as one family's tragedy had grown into something larger. Rachel's name. Every year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, people gather at Honeymoon Island. Some knew Rachel. Most never met her. They come because her case represents something greater. They come to show that memory matters, that justice matters, and that no one should ever vanish into silence. The legacy of Rachel Monroe is not only about loss. It is about determination. It is about community. And it is about the belief that justice delayed is not justice denied. If this story has moved you, take a moment to reflect on the importance of never giving up. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to hear more stories of cold cases where truth finally comes to light, subscribe to this channel. Every case has a voice. Every victim deserves justice. And every story deserves to be told.